All right, amazing. Well, thanks, Bianca and Lena, for inviting me. This is very exciting to be giving this first talk of the Cambridge Psychedelic Society. Yes, as they said, I am currently a postdoc research associate at the Consciousness and Cognition Lab in the University of Cambridge. Recently finished my PhD at Imperial. And just to give a bit of an overview of what how the talk is going to go, more or less, I made this talk to be sort of semi-outreach, right? So if you know nothing about neuroscience, there'll be a few things towards the end that you may find difficult or unintelligible. If you know a lot about neuroscience, there might be things towards the beginning that you'll find obvious and boring. But that is as expected, ideally. Good. So before we start, I should point out all of this work is actually work in collaboration with people from the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, Imperial College, and the University of Valparaiso in Chile. And without further ado, this is how the talk is going to go, by the way. I've already started in the right way. But yeah, I'm going to start by giving sort of this very detailed and sort of nuanced picture of what, altered states of consciousness are and what we care about them and blah, blah. And then I'll move on to a few other topics and ideally I'll manage to finish and get towards the end, but it might be a bit rushed. There you go. So, consciousness science. I'm a scientist. I'm guessing some of you are. And the scientists, what do we do? We poke things with a stick. That's basically what we do. And sticks take many different forms. If you're a particle physicist, a stick is a multi-billion-dollar particle accelerator. If you're a consciousness scientist, there's no better stick to poke people's minds than psychedelics, in fact. And now, if you see sort of these sticks, and we take psychedelics as the basic stick for consciousness science and other fields like psychiatry, for example, I think it's actually quite telling. No wonder the field of psychiatry hasn't moved forward very much, because for the last 60 years our sticks have been banned by the law. And that's actually quite suboptimal. Imagine how the field of nephrology would look like if you find a plant and you say, aha, well, this plant makes me pee. And then Richard Nixon comes and says, you cannot have that. So, that is, I believe, an important component of, why we're seeing this resurgence now in psychedelic science, consciousness science, and psychiatry. But ultimately, my whole point with all of this is going to this whole thread through psychedelics as a basic tool to poke into people's minds and into people's consciousness. So let's have a look at the word psychedelic for a minute. This is the Cambridge Psychedelic Society. I figured we could do with a bit of etymology. It comes from the words psyche, that means mind or soul, and velos, means manifest or reveal, excuse my Greek. And according to the Wiktionary, this is defined as any psychoactive substance, such as LSD or psilocybin, which, when consumed, causes perceptual changes, sometimes erratic and uncontrollable, visual hallucinations, and altered awareness of the body and mind. One interesting thing that actually I was thinking recently is that if you look at the word psyche and the word velos, like mind revealing, mind manifesting, at no point it says drug. There could be many other things which are psychedelics and are not pharmacological in nature. And in fact, we will see some of those throughout the talk. And funnily enough, while I was looking this up, I also realized that in the Wiktionary, there's a definition too of psychedelic as awesome, cool, and groovy, apparently. Which, I cannot but agree. Now, so the basic problem is this. Now, going back to this notion of altered states of consciousness, why are they instant? And for this, I find this metaphor particularly powerful. You have a brain, roughly in here. Most people do, not everyone, but say most people do. And that brain has a bunch of neurons that are wired together, and they sort of go click in very, very particular ways. And they go click in such particular ways that it feels like something to be that brain. You have a first-person felt experience. And that is in itself quite remarkable. That allows you to see things and perceive and, think and reflect and deliberate. That is in itself quite amazing. Now let's take this to this modern analogy of brains as information processing devices, so almost brains as computers. Your computer also has a bunch of transistors that go click in very precisely calculated ways. Altered state of consciousness? Oh, your computer also has a bunch of transistors that go click in very precisely calculated ways. Now, imagine you put a few micrograms of a completely alien substance, something that your microtransistors transistors have never seen in their evolutionary history. Then you turn on the computer, and the computer, instead of setting on fire, it writes a novel. And that's exactly what happens in your brain when you're on psychedelics. It literally only takes a few molecules per neuron of LSD to make your brain sort of hear smells and, see, touch, and, perceive colors and all sorts of altered states, as we shall see. So I find this a particularly interesting scientific phenomenon. Like, why does this happen? What are the physics of the brain? I'm a physicist by training, so what kind of physical system is this that with such a tiny, minute alteration to the dynamics of every neuron causes such a massive systematic change? And that's what the field of altered states of consciousness is about. So one tricky thing of studying altered states of consciousness are defined with respect to some normal states of consciousness. And that's kind of tricky because we don't actually know very well what consciousness is. So defining an altered state is a bit tricky. But let's say we can define it roughly as a complex, multifaceted change in experience. And as I was saying before, there's many ways of inducing one of these altered states or psychedelic states of consciousness. Some of them are pharmacological, some of them are non-pharmacological. The first time I showed this slide in a similar talk, someone sort of got up and said, the green dots, is that for the ones you tried yourself? I thought that was a great question. I should use it in my next talk, but no, they aren't. These are actually the ones that are compatible with standard EEG methodology. And we do have a bunch of neuroimaging studies of a bunch of these. And they're all extremely interesting, and studying the topology of this space of altered consciousness is in itself very, very interesting. One particular funny example is this flotation tank, for example, that you will see there's no green dot. So it's these sort of tanks these sensory deprivation tanks where you basically float in warm, salty water, completely in the dark, and that can actually induce some fairly strong hallucinations in some people after a long while. There's a group in Germany trying to get one of those into an fMRI scan. I'm not entirely sure how they're going to go about it, but hey. And one of the things, and so this is a plot there's a plot from a Nature Neurobiology paper from 2010 from these very, very good group of neuroscientists. I absolutely love this plot. And this plot was one of the things that made me think, okay, there's really something here. Yeah. What we're seeing here is sort of these 11 items of this thing called the Altered States of Consciousness Questionnaire, or ASC 11. And we're seeing in the diagram on the left, we're seeing three, the responses of people. You ask people a bunch of questions, and then you sort of analyze these questions to categorize the responses of these people along 11 dimensions. Here we're seeing 3 different doses of neuroscience, of psilocybin. Here we're seeing 2 different doses of ketamine. And what I find truly remarkable about this thing is that there's structure. Is that you get more psilocybin, and you get the same effects, but more. You have more ketamine, you get the same effects, but more. Whenever we see structure, that means we scientists have a job at explaining that structure. And this is, I find this really remarkable. This is one of the things that made me think, okay, there's something here. So this type of effect is what legitimizes the whole study of altered states of consciousness. And, eventually the goal with all of this is sort of quite ambitious, but, could be described as roughly linking physiology, what your brain is actually doing, what neurons are lighting up and down, so how our electric field's moving about, with phenomenology, with how you feel, with how you think, with the first person felt experience. That's what we want to do. And there are some relatively established scientific methodologies about this at this point. So we can have a bunch of subjects, and then we have different induction methods, and we both simultaneously image them and then ask them, say, how did you feel? What was your experience like? And then we analyze all of this mess and try to come up with some conclusion. And then there's roughly the methodology in this. Of course, psychometric questionnaires are not yet at the stage of getting to the bottom of felt experience, but I believe there's a lot of progress to be made with this type of basic methodology. So in this talk, in particular, we're going to be covering 2 altered states of consciousness. One is musical improvisation. The other one, the psychedelic state, induced by LSD. So again, what I said before about psychedelics being stuff other than drugs, from now on, whenever you say psychedelic, it's probably going to mean LSD. Okay. Any questions so far? Excellent. You're all experts in altered states now. So before we actually go into these two examples, I'd like to go into, just give you a brief overview of one of the major theories that help us sort of try to make sense of all of this. And that is this thing called the entropic brain hypothesis. And the entropic brain hypothesis comes from a very, very simple, actually, sort of assumption or idea. And that means that you have stuff going on in your mind, and then there's some stuff going on in your brain, which we can measure by sticking an electrode into it, or otherwise measuring its electric field. And then these two are somehow related. So if there's more stuff going on in here, there will be more stuff going on in here. So if you have richness of experience, in whatever way defined, is equivalent to a higher, sort of a richer signal diversity in what your brain is doing. So more diverse patterns in your brain activity means more diverse thoughts, which is very simple, but as we will see in a bit, can be quite effective. And this is outlined in this, I would say, fairly influential paper by Rob McHarris and a bunch of people in the Imperial Psychedelic group. And let's talk slightly about this entropic brain business. So first of all, talk about entropic brains. I'm guessing you have an idea what brains are. Maybe not all of you have an idea what entropy are. So let's go and have a look. Entropy is this object that comes from information theory. And you can think of it roughly as the maximal information content of a signal. That's the only bit of math in the whole talk, I promise. You can think of it as the maximal information content of a signal. So if you measure something and you want to say, well, how much, if this were another, one sender communicating with another receiver, meaning one neuron saying something to another neuron, how much could they be talking? It doesn't mean they are, but how much could they be talking? And entropy was developed by a mathematician and engineer called Claude Shannon around the times of the Second World War. And people typically, sort of, when they show pictures of Shannon, they show this sort of old, very serious man, like standing next to a Bell computer or whatever. I much prefer this picture of Claude Shannon kicking it at the unicycle. What a guy. And what does entropy roughly do? Very, very simply. So imagine we have a coin that could be biased. So sometimes it will come heads, sometimes it will come tails, and you don't know what the bias of that coin, how often it will turn up heads, how often it will turn up tails. If you plot the entropy of this coin as a function of this probability of you getting tails at any time, we see that it is 0 if the coin always turns up heads, and it's 0 if the coin always turns up tails, but it's highest 1 in between. So you can think of entropy as a notion of predictability, right? How well can I predict, or rather, how bad can I predict this thing? So if it always comes at heads, you always know what's going to happen. Entropy is 0. If it's right smack in the middle and p is equal to 0.05, you have no idea. You're maximally uncertain. Entropy is equal to 1. Very, very basic. Problem is, if you have a signal and you have a bunch of these coin tosses one at a time, you can have signals that are highly entropic, but nonetheless very, very boring. So for example, if I measure a signal and it goes 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, if I look at any one of them individually, I don't know very well, I have no idea if it's going to be a 0 or 1, but if I see a bunch of them in a row, I can still predict what's going to happen. So if we think of this in terms of diversity of thoughts and patterns and brain signals, you wouldn't really want to call that very entropic, would you? So what do we do about this? We find this thing called the entropy rate. Oh shit, there's 2 equations. Okay. We found this thing called the entropy rate, which is the entropy of the future values of the signal given the past values of that signal. And I like to split this in this sort of semi-philosophical way of stuff that's going on right now in the present is basically a sum of the stuff you inherited from the past plus some innovation, things that are happening, some new information that's coming in right now. And in particular is that innovation term, that entropy rate, that we're not going to be talking about, and we're going to start sort of putting electrodes in people's brains and start measuring. And in particular, we're going to measure this with levels of complexity or LZ complexity, which I'm not going to explain what it is, but basically whenever you see LZ in one of these slides, it's this measure of entropy or disorder, or unpredictability, uncertainty, all that stuff. Okay? If you're interested into coding theory, information theory, and how all that can be applied to computational biology, we can have a chat in a lot more detail later. But I'm going to skip all the math for now. Okay, so now we have a basic tool. We have this levels of complexity business that allows us to sort of look at a signal and say how much information is here, and we take the, how much innovation and how much new information is coming in at every time step, blah, blah. Does it work? Does the entropic brain actually predict anything useful? It kind of does, actually. So, for example, one of the early experimental findings with this levels of complexity is that it really goes down when you put people under anesthesia. So when they lose consciousness due to the effect of some anesthetic, in this particular case propofol, the Lempel-Zip goes down. So in all of these, this is the complexity, the Lempel-Zip complexity of people awake, and this is after you sedate them. You'll notice that here it says sleep. It's actually anesthesia. Like these engineers, they don't actually care. Like for them, all of it is the same. They just have a fancy information theory tool and they just throw it at places. So I look at myself in the mirror. So Lempel-Zip goes down when you're under anesthesia, very, very strongly. It also goes down when you go to sleep. So this is a similar experiment where they have this Lempel-Zip complexity, but after you zap people's brains, after you apply one of these transcranial magnetic stimulation. And you can see this huge divide. All of these are people sleeping and anesthesia, and all of those are people awake. And these are different subjects. You can see it's such a clear distinction. Basically, it has a 100% discriminative power. It's a super strong indicator of loss of consciousness, basically. It also goes down when people are in a vegetative state or in coma. And it actually goes up as you go from the vegetative state to a minimally conscious state to emerging from minimally conscious. And it's actually highest and the same as wakefulness for people that are in locked-in syndrome. So these are people that are perfectly conscious but otherwise completely unable or almost completely unable to move. That's actually a pretty terrifying condition. And we can see with these type of tools, we can actually look at their brain and measure what's going on, and actually there's an awful lot going on. But all this means that whenever you lose consciousness, this Lempel-Zip complexity business is such a reliable way of measuring it. And not only entropy goes down when you lose consciousness, be it through sleep, anesthesia, or disorders of consciousness, it also goes up when you're in the psychedelics, which is much more interesting for our purposes here. And you can see this in this absolutely terrible plot because the white dots are above the black dots. And we'll elaborate on a lot more on this topic. But this really sort of builds on this whole entropy spectrum, entropic brain theory stuff. That basically, if you measure the levels of complexity or the entropy of people's brains, it basically uniformly goes up as you go from vegetative state to anesthetized sleep, awake, and then finally psychedelics. In fact, psychedelics is basically one of the very, very few conditions where the entropy of a resting state brain goes above that of a normal waking, default state. That was, in fact, to my knowledge, the first time such state was actually found. So this does give, quite a bit of credibility, at least in this sort of roughly, rough and cartoonish way, this cartoonish depiction of the entropic brain hypothesis. But there's something for it. It actually holds some water. Of course, it's not capturing everything, and there's a lot of stuff that needs to be built upon, and we'll see. But at least, it does make a lot of sense, right? Again, going to this very fundamental principle of if there's a lot of stuff going on in your mind, then there's also a lot of stuff going on in your brain. Very simple, but actually turns out to work, quite surprisingly. Any questions so far? Yes?
So that graph is depicting the difference between each state as quite uniform. Is that accurate, or is it more?
Oh, no, at all. It's a cartoon, yeah.
So how much does the difference between, say, sleep and awake differ from that between awake and psychedelics?
It's hard to tell, actually, and one of the reasons it's hard to tell is because it changes a lot depending on the data modality you use. So some of these studies are using some types of EEG, versus another. Some of them are using MEG, which is the same with magnetic fields. We don't really have a very standard way of translating between one and the other. We know that if you compare the same people in two conditions, it always goes in the direction you expect. But we can't put numbers on an absolute scale just yet. Yes?
Is there any data about dreams, especially lucid dreams?
Yes, actually. And if there's... I wonder if there's some data in here. No, there isn't. But funnily enough, dreams are actually... This is dreamless sleep. When you have dreams, it's actually sort of in the middle. So it does go up slightly when you're dreaming. It doesn't reach the full awake value, but it's sort of in the middle.
And what about lucid dreaming?
I do not know. And the problem is that neuroimaging studies on lucid dreams are extremely expensive and extremely risky. Because imagine you bring a subject to the lab for one night that costs like probably hundreds of pounds, if not more, and then they just don't lucid dream that night. So there's very, very little imaging research on lucid dreams for purely economic reasons. Yes?
Ketamine is used in anesthesia but also has hallucinogenic qualities. Do we know if it increases or decreases the entropy levels in the hallucinogenic ketamine state?
It does increase. For small psychoactive doses of ketamine, and we're currently running some further studies with stronger doses of ketamine, because of course if you give enough ketamine to something, it will eventually go into a unconscious, like it's also used as an anesthetic, especially in like animals or children or whatever. So as far as I know, but how would I? But yeah, so we expect, ketamine is a really weird substance and we don't really know how it works, but I'm expecting there to be some sort of weird U-shape where if you get just a bit, it will be slightly above and then it might go down, conceivably. Is that another question?
Yeah.
Yes.
So can you explain again that innovation thing and what it means in terms of like, does it depend on what stimuli you're around or?
Very good question. You are approximately 20 slides ahead. I shall move on from now because we have 20 more slides. And then we'll revisit that question later. All right. So let's go now to our first example of an altered state, musical improvisation. Any of you musicians in the audience? Yeah? Okay, not very many. Do you improvise? Okay. Oh, a few more. Excellent. So at first I was actually kind of reluctant to consider musical improvisation as an altered state. I'm a musician myself, and I was like, well, I mean, there's a huge gap between, tripping and improvising, right? But I've been increasingly convinced that it is, and I'll gonna give a few examples. I'm hoping it will convince you as well. The first one of them is this incredible quote from Julio Cortázar's book El Perseguidor, or The Pursuer. And there's a book about Charlie Parker. I'll read the quote for you. Hell no, I don't get lost when I'm playing. Only the place changes. It's like an elevator. You're in an elevator talking with people. You don't feel anything strange. Meanwhile, you've passed the first floor, the 10th, the 21st, and the city's down there below you. And you're finishing the sentence you began when you stepped into it. And between the first words and the last ones, there's 52 floors. I realized that when he started playing, I was stepping into an elevator, but the elevator was time, if I can put it that way. If that's not an altered state of consciousness, you have to tell me where it is. I find that quote incredible. It mixes everything: language, time, space, music, like actual experienced professional improvisers do completely get into an altered state. It's a whole world. You lose your sense of time, you lose your sense of space, you become the music you're playing, and that's incredible, totally worth studying as an altered state of consciousness. So our driving hypothesis with this research, in collaboration with the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, is to characterize this thing we've come to call the improvisational state of mind. The state of mind that you're in when you're improvising music in this extremely sort of fluent, immersive way. One of the ways of characterizing this is with this concept of flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. That says he described the holistic sensation that people feel when they act with total involvement. And you can also sort of think about this from the point of view of the entropic brain theory as one of these primary states of, in the entropic brain hypothesis or theory, there's these primary states and the secondary states, and so the primary states are these states that are characterized by this higher entropy and this sort of overall just intense experience. And the secondary process or secondary states are those that basically constrain and shape the primary states to basically form a steady or a temporally stable sense of ego or self, for example. So in that sense, you could totally see improvisation as some form of primary state as understood within the entropic brain theory. So the picture we want to build is one in which we have sort of primary states as a broad spectrum word to include all of this. Some of these might be flow states, and we hypothesize that the improvisational state of mind is one of those. And I should note that actually these musical improvisation, when we think of musical improvisation, we think of it as jazz, and sort of, this guy that you might actually recognize, going wild and doing all sorts of flights of fancy. But actually, it is surprisingly also very important in classical music. And people like Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, all of these were actually very, very good improvisers. So we're going to be talking about, especially, about classical improvisation, which is very interesting, actually. And also much easier to study from the scientific point of view, because actually the variation between strict and improvised, So what we did was basically play a concert, organize a chamber music trio concert, where the musicians play the pieces twice. One in a mode that we call strict, and the other one in a mode we call let go. And we basically wired up the flute player, the piano, and the singer, as well as 4 audience members. And then we measured all of them while people played. And of course, the audience didn't know if the music they were listening to was strict or let go. And one of the things that makes us, more amenable to scientific studies, actually the changes between strict and let go are noticeable, but they're relatively subtle and they're small, so they're much more controlled. And if we have a couple of minutes, let's say we do, try yourself. So this is a recording from that concert. I'm going to play 2 recordings for you of about 30 seconds each. I want you to tell me which one, the first or the second, you think is the let go version. Second one, but I forgot to mention it works better with your eyes closed. Okay, who thinks the improvised let go version is the first? Who thinks it's the second? Yeah. It's subtle, but it's there. Can you notice it's the same notes, and yet they play it very, very differently. Very interesting. And if you ask them, how do you feel? The musicians feel differently, and they say, in the strict performance, they report very little sense of connection between the performance, increased performance anxiety, and internal critical chatter. Whereas in the let go performers, they report a greater sense of connection, trust in my own musical instincts and capability. The freedom of the let go mindset allowed me to create a wider range of colors and dynamics. So musicians very, very clearly report being in a different state of mind when they play let go. And not only that, but actually people noticed. So when you ask people, how innovative do you think this music was? How sort of emotionally charged or how risk-taking was the performance? Both people that know about music and even people that don't notice the difference, right? Of course, for people that actually know the music, the difference is massive. Also, these people are very, very good classical musicians. Like, the recording doesn't really do them justice. but they're very, very good. But yeah, even people that don't know what they're listening to can still notice a difference. I mean, even you did, right? So I'm not saying, I'm not putting you in either category, but. And then, okay, so how about neuroscience? How about brains? If we put some electrodes on these people's brains and we go and, of course, measure the level-zip complexity, and level-zip complexity goes up when they improvise. Success. And not only that, but it happens for basically almost every member, every participant in the experiment, except for this one guy, who we don't really know what he was thinking about. But yeah, we do see this very, very strong, sort of relatively strong increase in level-zip complexity when people play in this improvised state. And not only that, but actually the effect of this sort of this change in this increase in entropy and complexity comes from the right hemisphere, for most of them, in fact. And that's also interesting. So there's these sort of old, folk neuroscience theories about, the right hemisphere being your like creative, divergent hemisphere, and then the left being the logical, analytical. That has been massively overhyped, of course, but there's some kernel of truth in it, and this sort of goes in that direction. We see these very, very strong increases in entropy on the right hemisphere of certainly all the musicians and also some of the audience members. So all of this sort of really, first of all, it asserts the importance of musical improvisation, not only in jazz, but also in classical music. And I think this is part of I don't know if those of you who play music, if you've been through classical music school, I found it a pain. I found it very restrictive, very constraining. And they could totally do with a bit more improvisation training. They could totally do with letting people flow a bit more and do their thing. And I think this completely asserts the importance of this, not only for the musicians, but also for the audience, right? The audience notices, the audience actually likes it. And we see there's some communication, there's some effect. So it's really quite important. And also the data supports the existence of this improvisational state of mind, which you want to link through with this, states of flow and primary states of consciousness according to the entropic brain hypothesis. Any questions so far about musical improvisation? Yes?
What accounts for the differences between the audience members? Why music?
We don't know. But we're actually running, so we have data from another experiment where we have not one, but 40 audience members. And we're hoping to find out. Yeah, the answer is I have no clue. Yes?
So what happens to the entropy if you just do some concentrated work and you just try to focus on something very intensely? Does it also increase? Or?
Very good question. We don't know very well how it relates to cognition, because it hasn't been picked up by the cognitive neuroscience literature just yet.
Because could you explain this increase by just saying, well, if you play in this let go mode, you may be a bit more focused about what the others are doing, you think a bit more about it, and therefore your brain.
Conceivably. Yeah, I'm not against that explanation, but I also don't particularly know. Yes?
How relevant was that increase in LSAT, as if you could compare that to like sleeping and being awake or something?
It's smaller than the difference between sleep and awake, but it is measurable. And there's some, again, because, for the same reasons before, we can't really make very strong statements because they were not measured with the same headset and blah, blah. But, it is clearly there, but also clearly smaller. Yes?
This might be a weird one, but so did you try playing the let go first and the other one second, and then try with another set of people the other way around?
Giving talks?
No.
Or in the experiment?
No, like the musical.
Oh, so the music, all of those were randomized, like order randomized. So there was a concert with several pieces played, and the order in which each one of them was strict versus let go was randomized. Of course, the musicians knew because they got to play, but the audience didn't know. And we see very, very similar effect regardless of order. So yeah, that's a very obvious question, right? Because it could be a matter of what's coming.
Yeah.
And if you know what's coming, then that would explain a lot of effects. But no, that doesn't seem to be the case. Yes?
But the right hemisphere is also responsible for attention, right? And alertness, right?
Yeah.
So all of your results could also be explained by alertness?
Yeah, it could some of it be explained by alertness or awareness more broadly understood. Yeah. I mean, this is all like super interesting and very necessary work of like taking these like LZ measures and taking them more to a cognitive kind of domain to actually figure out what they're measuring. I am not comfortable to answer. I don't know if anyone else in the audience is. But yeah, we can chat about that later. Cool. All right. And then, psychedelic state. So just to give a brief recap of where we are so far, we started introducing these altered state of consciousness, more broadly how they're an incredible tool to study consciousness, and then went through this entropic brain hypothesis so that it actually makes some useful predictions for sleep anesthesia, source and loss of consciousness. It goes up when you're improvising, and now we're going to talk about what this liberative complexity does under psychedelics. And there's one particular feature, one very important feature of the psychedelic experience, which is that it is extremely diverse. Right? Sort of no two experiences are the same, no two substances are the same. And I think this is very well illustrated by these paintings of cats. By this, I mean, you have to, if you want to look at people sort of making paintings of cats and sending them to each other, you don't need Facebook. This was the 1920s. Actually, it's a very interesting life story. The guy that painted this is a guy called Louis Wayne, who in his 20s got married to a much older woman who, that wasn't very well seen at the time. His family kicked him out. He lived with his wife. His wife, and their cat. His wife sadly passed away very, very shortly afterwards, and he spent the rest of his life drawing pictures of, her cat in different conditions. As you get pictures of the cat playing golf and the cat doing things or whatever, and it got progressively more abstract as sort of he got older. So psychedelic phenomenology, I mean, I guess some of you may know what it's about, but just say what people report when they're in these experiments in psychedelics. One very clear phenomenon that appears is that there's the onset of audiovisual hallucinations. Right? So with eyes closed, I saw geometric patterns. There's this distortion of soul models where people lose their sense of ego. They call this ego dissolution or ego death in the extreme cases. And there's also some increased cognitive flexibility of my thoughts wandered freely. Of course, whether that cognitive flexibility can actually be focused on doing something, that's a very important question. There's also a bit of research on using psychedelics for creative problem solving. That is, I wouldn't say it's conclusive at all just yet, but there's certainly this feeling of being overwhelmed by the speed of your own thoughts. And we're going to see some of that in a bit. But before I start actually showing you the results of our own work with psychedelics, I'd like to make a bit of a disclaimer in here, which is that actually we have no idea what we're doing. Right? So psychedelic research is messy, it's counterintuitive. I'm going to show a bunch of results here that are going to highlight just how messy and counterintuitive this whole is. All of these results are trustworthy, they're reliable, the people behind them really know what they're doing. I'm just going to show a few flashy, weird cases just to show how deeply counterintuitive neuroscience can be. So there's a few slides titled Psychedelic Neuroscience is a Mess. Part 1. Neurons don't actually work. So in psychedelics, we believe we have this intense experience, this fastest stream of consciousness. There's just so much stuff going on. Except you have radically decreased brain activity all throughout the brain. Your brain, very, very literally, it almost shuts down. And this, for those of you who know, these are t-values of -9. You never see a t-value of -9, ever. And you see them here. And you can see this. So this is a power spectrum with how much signal variance or power is in each particular frequency, and there's just a massive drop from LSD to placebo. So very counterintuitive, but your brain activity actually goes down. We also, when you're on psychedelics, you think you have this sort of intense, sort of raw perception, right? You can see more colors, you can perceive and hear more, and everything is very overwhelming. Except actually you report seeing more colors, but you actually see less. So your visual discrimination abilities, go down very, very heavily. This is one of these old studies with psychedelics back in the 60s, so these mescaline and weird stuff, all in the same people. Not at the same time, I believe, but still. So this probably needs some replication. It's probably due, but again, very counterintuitive. What you actually do is not always, or it doesn't seem to align with what you think you're doing. there's also, you may have seen, if you've been sort of reading a bit about psychedelic neuroscience recently, you may have seen this funky plot by Giovanni Petri and some people from Imperial, where you see these new connections formed between brain regions and blah blah. This was even featured in this recent documentary called Explained, or Psychedelics Explained, that's in Netflix. And you have like pharmacology professors going and saying, oh look, there's more connections between the brain. That's actually not what this means. And this graph is an entirely counterintuitive graph that unless you have a PhD in network science or you happen to know what the hell a functional persistent homology scaffold network is, that's really hard to interpret. It took me several days to pronounce it. I've been practicing for a while now just to say it in this talk. So this doesn't actually mean your brain is more connected. In fact, what happens is that there's a communication breakdown. So the information transfer between, so in general, blue means less and red means more. Information transfer goes down all over the place. Whereas correlation goes up. So correlation is typically referred to in neuroscience as functional connectivity. So yeah, correlation goes up, but information transfer goes down. And so this is a bit of a subtle point, but actually, if there's less communication but more correlation, then maybe that's not neurons talking to each other as much as it is all of them saying the same thing, which is kind of odd, because you would expect all of these communication between different parts of the brain, synesthesia, cortices doing stuff. Basically, most of it is just less, which is odd. Again, there's nothing mutually contradictory. It's just counterintuitive, to me at least. But let's say, okay, fine, there's this increase in functional connectivity, increase in correlation all over the place. So, ego dissolution, reported ego dissolution correlates with this functional connectivity. Lines are going up. Yeah, fine, fair, no problem. Except you look at a different part of the brain, and then ego dissolution anti-correlates with functional connectivity. Damn it. Of course, these are two different parts of the brain, and it could be that they do different things, and you could build a story around inter-network, intra-network business, sure. But it's a mess. That's the whole point I'm trying to make. So another thing, for example, talking about entropy that I've been sort of blasting about for the last 40 minutes now, entropy goes up, and you have this increased sort of flexibility of thought. So there's more stuff going on in your brain signals, and there's more stuff going on in your thought patterns, blah, blah, whatever. It's all fine and good. Maybe this is what helps you sort of lift people up from sort of compulsive thought patterns, and then maybe help them actually get sort of cured from depression or use psychedelics as a mental health treatment, right? Except depression patients also have increased entropy. Damn it, I've never been owned by a plot as ugly as this one for a very long time. Also, these are engineers, don't know what they. And of course, I should say there's a lot of potential confounds with this. They don't actually say the patients were medicated or not, or what they were doing, or maybe depressed people are more anxious because they're in an experiment or whatever. We don't know. But that's the point, we don't know. Okay. So with all of those caveats in mind, let's actually talk about the experiment that we did at Imperial. I want to tell you a few findings that we found and sort of hopefully how those point a bit forward. But yeah, again, bearing in mind that, this psychedelic and conscious neuroscience in particular is messy. Neuroscience in general is also very messy, but we're on it. So the experiment we did at Imperial, we had 16 subjects in 4 conditions with different stimuli. And this goes back to the stimuli point that was brought up before. We have people basically take LSD or a placebo substance, either with their eyes closed and no music, with eyes closed listening to music, with eyes open and just resting state, versus eyes open and watching a video. In this particular case, it was an extract from the Blue Planet documentary, some sort of time lapse of glaciers and some trippy stuff. I am very upset that the music was not Pink Floyd, but that was not my decision to make. And then again, all these subjects were sort of scanned with after a placebo infusion or after an LSD infusion. And what do people actually say? We go and ask them, and so they fill in all these questionnaires. And one of the things that came out very, very clearly is that music boosts subjective phenomenological ratings. So for basically all across the board, if you look at the green line is around basically all the others. And that says that people reported more positive mood, more complex imagery, simple imagery, ego dissolution, emotional arousal, and intensity of experience all over the place, music seems to like enhance the psychedelic experience. And there's of course a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence for this, but now we're also starting to get some of this from actual psychiatrists, right? Of like how music can be thoughtfully and carefully used to guide the psychedelic experience and maximize therapeutic outcomes. Now, if you go to neuroimaging results, this is a very, very interesting plot and very dense plot. So one thing we see is that entropy, of course, entropy increases with LSD, meaning blue boxes are higher than the orange boxes, as expected, as also obtained in the previous result. It's good to see something that replicates for once. And also very interesting levels of entropy increases as external stimulation increases. So that's kind of interesting, and sort of it could be interpreted as sort of some of this, increasing your sort of contents of consciousness in some way. But what I find more interesting actually is that the effect of LSD decreases with external stimulation. So if you look at the difference between these two lines, the difference grows smaller as you stimulate, as you like show people music or they open their eyes or videos or whatever. Right? So this really goes to show that this very eyes closed, resting state, inward focused, that's where the effect of LSD is actually felt the most. Like people report it, and we can also measure it with these measures of entropy. And now let's look at, this effect actually is not only on entropy, and also there's some very subtle effects. So let's look in particular at these two parts of the brain. One is the default mode network, that's sort of these little bright chunks over there. And this default mode network is sort of linked with lots of basically processes that sustain our sense of self. Right, as we were seeing before, when this default mode network breaks down, you have this sense of ego dissolution and blah, blah. And the amygdala is so this area that's been related a lot with emotional processing and subliminal, like subconscious reactions to emotional stimuli and that type of stuff. What we see is actually when people have their eyes closed, the increase in levels in the default mode network correlates very well with the reported feeling of ego dissolution. And the effect of the increase in levels in the amygdala correlates very, very well with the positive mood. But not only that, if you get them to watch a video, you lose that correlation completely. Right? So in both cases, bang, the thing's lost. There's no effect whatsoever. And that, I find it quite remarkable. Another thing that I find very mysterious is that one guy over there that has a negative score of ego dissolution, that apparently had his or her ego more dissolved with a placebo than with LSD. Fine, I guess. And this is actually only partially cherry picking. Let's look at all of them. So we have sort of these, this is a correlation matrix, right? So a dark spot means highly correlated variables or measurements. A white spot means not correlated at all. And these variables are variables representing the mind, so basically subjective reports. And these variables are some representing the brain, so the entropy of these different brain regions. And we see that when people are with their eyes closed in this sort of introspective state, there's some correlation here and there, and you can make some associations between them and you can interpret it. Same thing when people are listening to music. Same thing or similar thing when they're with their eyes open. And this is what happens when they're watching a video. Gone. This, the presence of this sort of very absorbing, external focused stimulation that's this video, it completely decouples your mind from your brain. The effect of the drug is no longer on you, it's in your brain. But this, or maybe the correlations are just elsewhere, but the effect is really stunning. Right? It somehow captures these processes that you use to report or that mediate your subjective experience, and they just do something else. It completely dominates the neural signal all over the brain, essentially. So basically what we looked at before was just two particular points in this matrix, but you will see that it's a very, very prevalent effect. And that was basically all of my experimental results. I'm going to call it to a close. So what I have learned with this whole exercise and the psychedelic state is that both personal expectations and external environment have measurable effects on the brain. And this is what people have been calling for a very long time, the set and setting. We're measuring here, we're putting numbers on the effect of setting on the psychedelic experience. And the answer is quite a lot, basically. And not only that, but we also see much, much stronger effects in more inward-focused state, in this sort of eyes closed, almost meditative inward-focused state. Or, as my friend John would put it, tripping is easy with eyes closed. All right, so let's wrap up real quick, and because I guess we might want to go to the pub or something. So as a brief wrap up, the scientific study of altered state of consciousness is I find an absolutely incredible endeavor, and it really allows us to tap into how the brain generates experience, and it's through these altered states that we poke things. That's our stick, to poke people's brains with. I mean, a Entropy Rate hypothesis is very, very simple, yet actually quite powerful. Now, of course, it's limited, and consciousness is not a one-dimensional spectrum, but damn, there's something about it. Right? As a physicist, I really like theories that are conceptually simple, yet predictably, empirically powerful, and this is totally one of them. It's not complete, but it's a very good one. You get a lot of bang for your buck. Of course, all of this, we still don't have a clue, right? And all of it is a mess, and there's still lots of work to be done. But I find it's an absolutely fascinating field to be working in. And with that, I shall conclude. Thanks a lot to the Consciousness and Cognition lab in Cambridge, to the Psychedelic Research Centre at Imperial, and to the Cambridge Psychedelic Society here in Cambridge. Any questions?